have time for, but we're just going to go as far as we can. And when it's like 10 minutes until the end, I'm just going to start taking some questions and we'll go from there. So, oh, Dr. Laboda, if you don't mind, enable screen sharing. I had the button, but when I pressed it, it wouldn't let me do it.
Is it letting you?
Let me see here. Yes, sweet. Okay. We're good to go. All right. So we're going to do this a slightly janky way, so I still have access to all of these recordings. But obviously the saxophone was a completely invented instrument. Unlike the clarinet, unlike the flute, unlike most of the other woodwinds, we know exactly who invented it. And he invented it in a form that we would pretty much recognize today. So Adolphe Sax lived from 1814 to 1894, and he was originally from this small town in Belgium called Gap, which is where today they have the International Adolphe Sax Competition, and it's this gorgeous city that's built right up next to this big bluff. It's absolutely breathtaking. But his father was the official instrument maker to the king of the Belgians, and he initially had a pretty successful, very early career, won a bunch of prizes, pretty much invented the modern bass clarinet, made a lot of improvements to brass instruments. But eventually he started running into a lot of opposition from some of the older instrument makers in Belgium. In fact, he did really well at this competition, but they wouldn't give him the first prize because they said, well, you're just in your 20s, you're too young. We're not going to be able to give you anything later. So like every saxophonist, he was completely incensed at this and said, well, I'm getting out of here if you guys aren't going to appreciate me. So he moved to the big city of Paris in 1842 when he was between the ages of 27 and 28. And there he just started this incredible career as an inventor and as just this one-man army leading the charge for musical progress. So he made friends with a whole lot of heavy hitter composers. He was really into contemporary music, and he wanted his instruments to support a lot of things that people were doing in terms of enlarging the orchestra and looking for new sounds. So he invented the saxophone sometime in 1838. We're thinking around there. He waited until 1846 to patent it, but it was out in the open by 1839, 1840. By 1842, he had shared it around enough that Hector Berlioz knew about it and was writing about it favorably in this Paris newspaper called Journal des Débats. Now, the first saxophone was a bass in C, and I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. If you look at the patent drawings, it's really interesting. This is the original patent for the saxophone. And the earliest saxophone was actually probably either this instrument or this instrument. He at least had some prototypes that were shaped like this. Now, this has led a lot of people to believe that probably the initial idea for this low saxophone in C came from the ophicleide, which was a brass instrument with keys. That was the main orchestral bass at the time. The problem with the ophicleide is it sounds awful. Here's a good example of how bad it sounds. Now that's about the best anybody can do playing ophicleide, and it's still really unstable, and they're working really hard to make that be in tune. It's really weird. It's literally a keyed brass instrument. These are cupped mouthpieces, just like you would expect with a euphonium or a tuba, but instead of valves, there were keys all along the body of the instrument. So the earliest saxophones, at least the prototypes, were probably the same style, and a lot of people say, well, he just took an ophicleide, put a saxophone mouthpiece on it. That's not true because even the earliest saxophones that we have are pretty advanced instruments that weren't just kind of an amalgam. But at least he was getting the idea, hey, if you can have a keyed brass instrument, why can't we just make this a really nice projecting woodwind instrument, and I'd have more control and have more intonation adjustment. Unfortunately, they didn't catch on as orchestral bass winds as he intended. Pretty quickly, the higher members of the family became much more common. So this is a picture of a fairly early saxophone, and you look at it, and it looks a whole lot like a modern horn. The bell's a little shorter, it's a little wider, and there are fewer keys. You don't have a bis B flat, you don't have a front key, you're missing the front F and the E key, this only would have gone to E flat, and it only went down to about low B. But otherwise, aside from just a few extra keys, it's a remarkably similar instrument to what we have today. Another thing, there are actually 2 octave keys back here. The automatic octave key didn't come till later. So whenever you guys play Sanjole or Demersman or anything, be very thankful for the modern automatic octave key. So early on, Sax figured out, well, if I can't get the saxophone into orchestras, I'm going to get into bands. He really viewed the saxophone as being a bridge between the woodwinds and the brass because it had a lot of carrying power, but you also had all of the flexibility of the woodwinds and all of the technical abilities of the woodwinds. So he staged this. He had a lot of friends in the French government at the time, and he managed to get this general who was in charge of the entire French military on his side. And they staged this big contest in the Champ du Mars. Now, even if you guys haven't heard of the Champ du Mars before, you've seen it before, because it's where the Eiffel Tower is now. So, of course, I was the nerd when I was in Paris a few years ago. Everybody else was looking at the Eiffel Tower. I was like, this is the Champ du Mars. This is where the great band contest happened, because I'm that kind of guy. But Sax's band won hands down over the band of the time. And he got contracts to make his instruments for French military bands, not just saxophones, but sax horns, which are modern euphoniums, the little itty bitty alto horns, if you guys have ever seen a brass band, and lots of other instruments. They were also used in opera orchestras, especially by kind of friends and admirers of sax, like Georges Kastner, very early on. After the saxophone was introduced into French military bands, the instrument was taught at the Gymnase Musique des Militaires, starting in 1846, which was kind of a preparatory school for advanced band musicians. And in 1856, that school was closed, and its responsibilities were amalgamated into the Paris Conservatory. Sax was hired as the first saxophone teacher at the Paris Conservatory, but it wasn't a y'all come kind of thing. It was, if you were a really promising military bandmaster, they would send you to a couple-year course of study at the Paris Conservatory in this special military class. And that was the only place that you could study saxophone, unfortunately, if you were already a member of a military band. Sax was a really innovative businessman, but he wasn't a particularly good one. But he did sell instruments, and he also sold music for those instruments to drive demand. So some of the music that he published for saxophone, it was by a lot of friends of his who were composers: Jean-Baptiste Saint-Gelais, Jérôme Savary, Jules de Mersman. If you guys have ever seen the de Mersman Fantasy, the Savary, Der Freischütz Fantasy, any of those Saint-Gelais pieces, the quartets by Saint-Gelais, those were all written for sax to publish through his own publishing company, and also to use his pieces for sax in his own teaching at the Paris Conservatory. Most of the Saint-Gelais, if you guys have ever seen the premiere piece, deuxième piece, troisième, like the 70 million pieces that he wrote, most of those were kind of end of term jury pieces for the sax students in the military section of the Paris Conservatory. Some really great early saxophone soloists of this era, immediately after sax, included Louis Meyer, who was a Belgian, who studied with sax at the Paris Conservatory in the military division, and eventually became saxophone soloist of the Paris Opera. Now, when I say he was saxophone soloist, I mean he played like the 3 pieces that had saxophone in them. But he managed to make it work. And then the other great early soloist was Edvard Lefevre, who was a Belgian-born virtuoso, clarinetist, and saxophonist, who would carry the saxophone on into the United States and help establish its popularity here. So the saxophone wasn't used in military bands or any kind of wind band in the United States until fairly late in the 19th century. American bandmaster Patrick Gilmore was the leading conductor of his time. He'd been a great military band conductor in the Civil War. He led the New York 22nd Regiment Band. And after the close of the hostilities in the Civil War, he decided he was going to have this giant band festival and bring all bands from all over the country to Boston for the National Peace Jubilee to celebrate the end of the Civil War. And this was such a big commercial success that he actually ended up having a World Peace Jubilee in Boston at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, which was kind of a precursor to the World Wars. So he invited bands from all over the world in 1872. And one of the great bands that he invited was the band of the Garde Républicaine, the Republican Guard Band of Paris. And this band still was one of the early adopters of the saxophone, but they'd had about 20 years to get used to the idea of this, and they had a really well-developed repertoire that utilized saxophone very well. The saxophone was completely integrated into the ensemble, and there were 6 or 7 saxophones in the band at that time. So he was really taken with the sound of this group, and he decided he was going to integrate saxophones into his own bands. So he hired Lefevre as soloist because Lefevre was touring the United States with a touring opera company. And Gilmour had heard about him and said, okay, this is the guy I need. So Lefevre became Gilmour's first saxophone soloist, played all kinds of solos with the band. It's really clear that he had a knowledge of the repertoire that had been written for sax, because his New York Saxophone Quartet Club, the first professional saxophone quartet in the United States, was playing pieces by Saint-Gelais. Also, Carol Florio, if you guys have ever played the Florio Quartet, that was written for Edward Lefevre and his New York Saxophone Quartet Club. It was the first American saxophone quartet written, and one of the first pieces for any kind of solo or chamber saxophone written in the United States. A whole lot of bandmasters followed Gilmour's lead when they started hearing saxophones in these bands and saw what saxophone could bring to the ensembles. John Philip Sousa added them to the United States Marine Band when he was conductor of that ensemble. And by 1892, he had formed his own professional band, and saxophones were integral to his conception from the first. Gilmour had died in 1892 earlier, so Sousa hired Lefevre as his first soloist. And Lefevre's hearing had started to go. He was getting a little bit older, so he eventually retired from performing and went on to teach at the C.G. Conservatory. I put it as it's normally spelled, but in advertising, they would actually put CONN dash Conservatory. Believe it or not, it was actually a very serious institution of musical learning that was sponsored by the Conn Corporation. And they were bringing in some of the finest performers who were usually people who sponsored their instruments as teachers. And you would have a real course of study leading to a certificate of professional musicianship. So in that way, at least, Lefevre had a big impact on the first generation of American saxophonists after him. Now, Sousa's other saxophonists include people like Jean Morimand, another Belgian saxophonist, H. Benny Hinton, one of the first great American-born soloists, and Russian-born Yasha Gurwitch. So just to give you an idea of what saxophonists sounded like at that time, here's a little scratchy recording of Jean Morimand, one of the great soloists of his own day. How do I do that, Dr. Laboda?
So go to the where the top thing and it says like options or something.
Let's see if I can do this. Share computer sound. There we go.
I discovered that and thought it was the best thing ever.
I need to do that because kids who have been exposed to COVID, I've been doing this in my class, and I hope that they have kind of, because nobody mentioned they hadn't been hearing the recordings. So let's listen to just a hair of this. So just from that little snippet, you can tell, okay, intonation was a little bit different back then. Also, the way he articulated pitches moving around just a little bit, but he has pretty decent technique and he has pretty decent tongue technique. An even greater early saxophone soloist was H. Benny Hinton, who is widely considered to be one of the greatest virtuosos of the instrument early on, and also had a really great early mastery of altissimo technique. He couldn't play maybe as high as we could today, but he had a pretty clean technique that he could run up to a high D, the one above the staff. And again, the relationship to intonation maybe isn't what we would hope today, but he had a pretty clean technique, all things considered. Now, probably the most important saxophonist at this time wouldn't have considered herself to be a professional, but she had some of the greatest impact on the future history of the concert saxophone. Elise Boyer Hall was originally a society woman. She was wealthy. Her husband had been a pioneering physician who unfortunately had developed an addiction to cocaine, which at that time was viewed to be a useful medication. So he eventually accidentally kind of died of that. But she had originally taken up the saxophone as she was having some breathing problems, especially some asthma problems as she approached her early 40s. And her husband and a couple of his colleagues suggested that she take up a wind instrument because at the time it was viewed as being really helpful in developing lung capacity and helping get through things like asthma. So she decided she loved the instrument and she became quite an accomplished performer. We can tell from the music that was written for her that she didn't have a, a lot of technique, but the music that was written was very advanced musically. And there were a lot of reviews from the time that suggest she was a very fine interpreter and a fine musician. But along with her friend George Longy, who was the oboe player in the Boston Symphony and later went on to found the Longy School of Music in Boston, she contacted most of the leading French composers of the time. Basically, anybody who had won the Prix de Rome from the Paris Conservatory, which was the prize for the most promising young composer to come out of the Paris Conservatory. She commissioned virtually all of them who had won over the span of about 20 years. And we have such pieces, the Debussy Rhapsody, probably the greatest early piece that we have, Florent Schmidt's Legende, Vincent d'Indy's Choral Verie, and a lot of other pieces. So we have her to thank for such a wonderful piece as this. This is just a little recording by Jean-Marie Londex. If you guys have never listened to an original version of that piece, do. The scoring is beautiful. That's not a bad recording. Good old Maestro Londex. Anyway, so along with Elise Boyer Hall, there were I'm backwards in time. Oh no. There were a lot of other interesting things going on at this time. So unlike today, when we think of saxophone manufacturers, Dr. Laboda is probably saying, all right, Selmer, Yamaha, Yanagasawa. Those are some of the bigger saxophone manufacturers that we view today as being of really high quality. Well, the only one of those that was around was Selmer Paris, and it really didn't start making saxophones until 1922. And they eventually bought Edouard Sax, Adolphe Sax's son's workshop in 1929, and they still consider themselves to be the successor to Adolphe Sax's workshop. However, the other two great manufacturers at this time were C.G. Kahn of Elkhart, Indiana, and the Buescher Band Instrument Company of Elkhart, Indiana. Gus Buescher had been one of the chief craftsmen and instrument designers at C.G. Kahn, had a business dispute with Kahn, and went on to form his own corporation. But from the early 1900s all the way through the 1940s, C.G. Kahn and Buescher were making some of the finest instruments on earth. And there's still people who really like those instruments. Intonation by a modern horn. But of course, the saxophone really only comes into its own and achieves the kind of levels of virtuosity that we would expect today, thanks to jazz. Saxophones weren't totally used in early New Orleans jazz, at least not recorded jazz. Oh no, no. It's okay to chat. That's fine. Oh, but you could see it. Sorry. Okay. So I'll knock the chat off here in a minute. Um, so the saxophone wasn't totally used in early recorded jazz. The clarinet was much more popular. Now, probably the saxophone had been used in New Orleans ensembles for quite a long time, and we have some evidence of that. Um, Early jazz bands were an outgrowth of marching bands. However, early recording technology wasn't great. The reason they were using a lot of the instruments they were in the first recordings was because it picked up fairly well in the acoustic recording technology at the time. That's why they were using banjos. That's why they were using tubas instead of string basses. And that's why they were using the clarinet instead of saxophone. But an early New Orleans clarinetist named Sidney Bechet um, eventually picked up a soprano saxophone and really started to get people licensed to use the saxophone more in recorded jazz. And this is a really good example of his playing later on in his career. And sometimes people use dumb pictures for YouTube videos. Anyway, but Sidney Bechet was one of the first great saxophone virtuosos in jazz, and of course that really started to open up the instrument, the possibilities that now existed when this new genre of music. The saxophone wasn't some also-ran. The saxophone wasn't some newcomer. The saxophone could become a symbol of this new music, and some of the greatest virtuosos of the music of the saxophone would come out of jazz. But what else was going on during this time? Well, the saxophone craze. When the saxophone first started to make an appearance in jazz, it was also becoming one of the most popular instruments of the 1920s. The 1920s and the saxophone are a lot like the 1960s and the electric guitar. It's this newfangled thing that not a lot of people had known about before that suddenly becomes an icon of a generation. So you have all of these professional ensembles, amateur ensembles start to pop up where people are playing the saxophone. And some of the greatest virtuosos of this time, they kind of existed between popular music and jazz and classical music, and all these people, it just smushed a lot of forms together. But mainly a lot of these people were playing on the vaudeville circuit, which was all about kind of fast, loud, crazy entertainment. A couple of the most popular were Rudy Weedolf and Benny Kruger. So this is a little film strip where the two of them are sharing their tools of the trade and kind of their shtick for a second.
Say, you're Rudy Weedolf, the famous saxophonist.
Discovered.
You're Benny Kruger.
Don't kid me, I know you.
Thanks, Rudy. Say, listen, Rudy, I'd like to hear you play some of those very fast runs that you've made so famous.
Fast run?
Those fast ones.
Well, a Babe Ruth, you mean? All right.
That's fine, that's fine.
Say, listen, Benny.
What is it, Rudy?
You know, they tell me you're quite a trickster on the saxophone.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Say, what is your impression of Prohibition?
Prohibition?
Mm-hmm.
Here goes.
He's got me doing. Say, listen, Ben, play that little laugh that you open your program, your teeth program, you know.
The laugh?
Yeah, show the folks
Here's how it's done.
Let's both do that. What do you think?
Both of us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Another really fantastic soloist of this era was Merle Johnston. And Merle Johnston actually has a direct connection to you guys because Merle Johnston was one of the few people who actually taught Larry Teal saxophone. Larry Teal taught John Nickel saxophone. John Nickel taught Dr. Loboto and myself saxophone. So you were like 4 people removed, whatever, from Merle Johnston. See if you notice any similarities in sound to stuff that you guys may have heard before. And Johnston was playing tenor saxophone in that recording through most of his life. Now, again, it's 1920s, there's vibrato all over everything, but his intonation is better than almost anybody else you would hear at that time. The core in his sound was bigger than almost anybody else you would hear at that time. And there are things that I hear in that whole lineage that do come from him, even though Teal studied with him for a week. But he was a major New York radio player as well as being on the vaudeville stage. So some crazy things were going on in saxophone construction and design during this time, because just like the electric guitar in the 1960s, musical instrument companies saw this as an opportunity to sell. And if somebody already had a saxophone, all they needed to do was come out with a crazier kind of saxophone, and maybe that person would buy another one. So these are just a few examples. The Kahn mezzo soprano. So this is a modern alto next to this quite a bit smaller, but still in the same shape, mezzo soprano, which really was just an alto in F, which Sax had listed as a possibility for something that he might try in the future, and only made a few of. But these were sold widely, and you can still, they made enough of them, you can still find them every once in a while. This is something that's much rarer, but very cool. This is the Kano sax. So it was a soprano, and it was an F. Yeah, and it was keyed all the way up to an altissimo G and keyed all the way down to a low A. I'm not talking like you had to do anything weird to get the altissimo G to come out. You had your D, your E flat, your E, your F, and then you had 2 in-between keys that you would hit with your knuckles for F sharp and G. It's really cool. I got to play one a couple of years ago. They're really nice saxophones. They have a lovely sound, and the way they're designed, they were originally supposed to be kind of substitutes for English horns, and the way they're designed, they have that kind of muffled quality. And then even Buescher made a straight alto and even a straight tenor, and there were all kinds of other wacko things that people tried just to try to sell saxophones. But as we get into this time, we also have the first really great jazz pioneers on saxophone. We had somebody like Frankie Trumbauer, who was an early pioneer who kind of bridged the Rudy Wiedoff and jazz thing, who originally started his career with a white cornetist named Bix Beiderbecke. Really interesting player with really high technique. And then in this area, you also had really the first great artists in jazz. Somebody like Coleman Hawkins with this recording of Body and Soul, which is widely considered to be one of the first early, really great improvised solos. We won't listen to the whole solo, but we'll listen to just a little bit. if you guys don't know this and you're into jazz, listen to this. This is something that I'm sure Dr. Laboda or Mr. Hitchcock would tell you to check out. This is one of the first great harmonically based solos where he was really exploring the outer reaches of the harmonic language. It's a beautiful solo. You can learn a ton from. Another great pioneer of the same era is the great Johnny Hodges, who spent the majority of his career as lead alto with Duke Ellington's band. One of the great first early jazz alto players who would influence Charlie Parker and everybody who came after. But this is a great example of his beautiful, expressive playing. Now, that's the recording from 1958, but he was playing like that in the mid 30s. And you think about the stuff we've heard from the 20s, you think how sophisticated his playing is. It's playing still extremely sophisticated in the modern era. But a lot of jazz players made this huge leap forward. Also, I said the thing about modern horns. There's still a bunch of jazz players who like vintage horns, and they're real nice for jazz playing. And that Buescher is about the same era as Mr. Hitchcock's tenor, I think, because I look at all the pictures and I want one. Anyway, another great pioneer of this era is the great Ben Webster, again, who would be a huge influence on Charlie Parker. So he played about 4 notes, and he played them about as swung and as cool as anybody has ever played 4 notes ever. Listen to Ben Webster. You can still learn so much from him. So on the classical side of things, we begin to have people that you guys have heard of, even if you haven't heard a lot of, about a lot of these other classical players. People like Cecil Leeson, if you guys have played the Creston Sonata, right at the top of the page. Creston Concerto, right at the top of the page. Marcel Mule, half the things in the world, right at the top of the page. Sigurd Roscher, the other half of stuff in the world at the top of the page. And of course, Larry Teal, who I've already talked about tonight, who's kind of mine and Dr. Laboda's pedagogical grandpa to a certain extent. Cecil Leeson was one of the first real classical saxophonists in the United States. He presented the first town hall recital on saxophone in 1937. Town hall was kind of the equivalent of Carnegie Hall at the time in New York City. And it was a big deal to be able to perform there. The Creston Sonata was written for him. The Creston Concerto was written for him. He went on in mid-1950s to start the saxophone class at Northwestern University before Fred Hemke took over, and eventually ended his career at Ball State University. This is just a little snippet of him playing the Paul Creston Suite for alto saxophone and piano with Creston. That's just a little snippet. Of course, another great pioneer was Marcel Muehl, who had an incredibly long career as a saxophonist and a chamber musician, and was the first teacher of saxophone at the Paris Conservatory since Adolphe Sax. Um, so you see him here. Actually, you don't see him here. Hold on. Ha ha. There you see him as a member of the Paris Republican Guard Band, which we've already talked about. He was soloist of that ensemble for several years, and would eventually become the saxophonist with the Paris Comic Opera and formed the Garde Republicaine Saxophone Quartet, one of the first great modern saxophone quartets in 1927. Eventually, this would morph into the Paris Saxophone Quartet and eventually the Marcel Muehl Quartet. And he would keep this ensemble going for virtually 40 years. That ensemble, a ton of literature that you guys have probably come into contact with, was written for them. Pieces by Alexander Glazunov, the Glazunov Quartet, Pierre, the piece in form Day Round on Popular Air, the Schmidt Quartet, Eugene Botza. This is a little snippet from some Botza written for them. Oh, lots of stuff going on there. Of course, he was also a great soloist, and there were tons of pieces written for him by a great variety of composers. Eugene Botza again, Alfred Desenclos, the Prelude, Cadence, et Finale was written for him. Paul Bonneau, the Tommasi Concerto, the Tommasi Ballade were written for him. Paul Maurice's Tableau de Provence was written for him. The Villalobos Fantasia was written for him. And he was also a consultant with the Selmer Corporation. He helped to design and was largely responsible for the Mark VI saxophone in 1954. And he taught a ton of people. Jean-Marie Landex, who we've heard a little bit of, Daniel Defaye, who was Claude DeLong's teacher, Fred Hemke, Eugene Rousseau, tons and tons of people who became very important saxophonists and saxophone teachers. So this is him performing live a little bit of Paul Bonneau's Caprice in Forme de Valse. There's still things in there where it's like, yeah, okay, that was a recording from 60 years ago. But those low Fs that he plays at the beginning of that, they sound so good. I want to do them that good when I play this piece. Oh. Along with Marcel Muehl, probably the other really big leader as far as soloist and production of literature goes is Sigurd Roscher. He grew up in Stuttgart, Germany. He studied clarinet at the Stuttgart Conservatory and originally just picked up saxophone so he could get some gigs playing with early dance bands. But he eventually figured out he really liked the instrument and got serious about it, moved to Berlin in 1930, and very quickly started getting involved in all the new interesting music that was going on in the city. A lot of composers were very interested in jazz, so they wanted to write classical music using some jazz influences, and that included using the saxophone. So he got a lot of work. He occasionally performed as a saxophonist for the Berlin Philharmonic in the early 30s, and he fled Germany in 1933 after the Nazis took over. Interesting fact, he fled Germany. Meanwhile, his brother, Sigmund, became a Nazi SS doctor. But he moved to Denmark, then Sweden, then the United States, and eventually settled in upstate New York. I can't describe to you how many pieces were written for him, but the ones you're most familiar with are probably the Glazunov Concerto, the Bear Concertino de Camera, the Mio Scaramouche, the Dahl Concerto, Lars-Erik Larsson's Concerto, the Husa Elegy at Rondo, not the concerto, Henry Cowell's Arid Scherzo, on and on and on and on. So this is him in his late prime in the early 1950s, playing just a little snippet of the Larsson Concerto. Oh, 60s? I don't think it's 60s. I think it's 50s. There it is. You come for roster, you stay for the high notes. So, of course, during the same era, you have some of the greatest saxophonists slash musicians who ever lived playing the instrument. People like Charlie Parker in the 1940s and 1950s. Who would go on to influence people like John Coltrane. I get low the solo. Wait for it. Every time I think I'm getting better at jazz, I listen to that and it makes me hate myself. Anyway, but by then we're getting into the modern era of the saxophone. Ooh, and a little free Coltrane, which I don't think we have enough time for, unfortunately. But the saxophone, obviously, throughout its history, so many people have been so expressive on the instrument. And throughout its history also, I hope you guys have noticed that it's not just a bunch of dead white guys. The saxophone has been this marvelous instrument, as all instruments are, that so much of its success is dependent upon the efforts of female musicians, musicians of color. And I think that's something to really be lauded and embraced, because it's so important to the history and development of the instrument. Anyway, I've talked for a long time. I've got my screen share off, so if anybody wants to ask any questions, don't be afraid now. Don't be afraid. Anyway, so questions, comments, woof, anything.
I guess my biggest question, something that I've been thinking about for a long time, is like, why do like a lot of orchestras and places around still not include saxophone?
Well, largely because a lot of the music that orchestras are performing today was written before saxophones existed. For whatever reason, there are orchestras around the country who are really willing to program new music. And we do have some stuff in that 19th century canon that does use the saxophone, things like Bizet's L'Arlésienne, the Ravel version is early 20th century, but the Ravel version of the Mussorgsky Pictures at an Exhibition, Bolero in the early 20th century, things that orchestras are willing to play. But a lot of the stuff that's most palatable, at least in the minds of people who do the programming, is, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. The other part of it is the saxophone was very much a French instrument. And if you noticed, a lot of French composers were writing for it, but who were the people in control at the end of the 19th century? Or German musicians. And this was a time, sax was a favorite of Napoleon III. At the time when, France and Germany were at odds, they would eventually fight the Franco-Prussian War, which is this huge cataclysm that ended up in half of France being taken over briefly, and Napoleon III losing his crown. So part of it was timing, and part of it was global politics at the time. But we've got a toehold in. I've made a small amount of money playing orchestral saxophone, and if nothing else, maybe they'll program some saxophone when they're doing the holiday concert with Sleigh Ride, because there's a saxophone part in that I played 5 times. So I think the weirdest orchestral gig I ever played, we played Bolero and Sleigh Ride. That was weird. I got money. I didn't care. It was fine. If we can get theremins in the orchestra, we can get. It largely depends on who's calling the shots. When I was in Wichita Falls, I got called half a dozen times to play some pretty nice stuff, including playing the first movement of the John Williams Escapades as soloist with the orchestra. Now, the conductor was a composer pianist who also, his secondary instrument was saxophone. He studied saxophone with Don Lefevre at West Texas State University when he was an undergrad. So you just got to find the right people. But actually, interestingly enough, their saxophone is now creeping into the orchestral establishment world. The new conductor of the Savannah Symphony here in Georgia is actually a saxophonist who studied with Tim McAllister. And then we have a lot of allies. The assistant conductor of Atlanta Symphony, who I think he just, I I think he got the gig in Buffalo. He got a pretty good main orchestral gig. Is the brother of Robert Young, great saxophone soloist who teaches at North Carolina School of the Arts. So we're slowly getting there. We just got to get the right people in the right places. What else you
I want
guys
to
got?
ask a question.
Yes,
I'll go. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. This isn't my usual setup. So this might be a stupid question, but it's something I've always wondered. So this is in relation to the build of the saxophone. I know you mentioned earlier it hasn't changed a lot, but something that I was just curious about in regards to right above the elbow of the sax or the bow, and not the circle part of the bell, but down here. In earlier models, it's a little bit thinner towards the elbow, and as time has progressed, it's gotten a lot wider. Is that for looks, or is that for intonation? Is that for a broader sound? And also, I noticed that I don't know what it's called, but it connects it to the tube key part. It used to be a lot longer, and as time has gone, it's a lot shorter and it's a lot closer to the keys. I was just wondering if it's for looks or if it's for tone and intonation purposes. So yeah.
You start this by saying this is a dumb question, which my line is always there is no such thing as a dumb question, because there isn't. If you're asking a question, you want to learn this. But then you ask me this fantastic thing that I can't totally answer, but that's a great question. Come on. So I know about half the answer to that. Most of the things that have been done to the saxophone, the earliest instruments, I haven't played one, but I played some really old saxophones. And something that you'll find about them is there's less projection. There is a much lower ceiling for how loud you can play on them.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the design changes that are visible, number one, have to do with intonation, to improve intonation, just as you were saying. And number two, to improve projection and the ability to go louder. One of the things with people who are kind of in Sigurd Roscher's camp, the reason they play the mouthpieces they play, and the reason they play Buschers and other really older American horns, they think they're closer to Adolf Sax's design. And if you play those mouthpieces and those horns, the ceiling's a little bit less. Okay. It's a very nice sound. People who do that really well. It's just there are fewer higher overtones in the sound, and it's just a little softer overall at its peak.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was a great question.
Thank you.
If I don't know it, I won't make it up, but I'll tell you as much as I know. Anybody else got anything?
I asked you all to have a question ready. Remember that?
I'll ask a question.
Okay, go, John.
You mentioned briefly the Selmer Mark VI. Mm-hmm. What makes it so special?
I think part of it is lore. They are really nice saxophones. Number one, at the time, they were some of the first saxophones to use actual acoustical research, and also just Marcel Muel's own. Claude DeLong actually does the same thing now, but Marcel Muel was one of the first people long-term to actually be a consultant to Selmer, and he would go in, from what I understand, every Monday, and he would play test horns, and he would sit down with the engineers and give them a bunch of feedback. And Claude DeLong now does that for Selmer. Literally every week or two, he'll go in, he has an office at Selmer, and he'll go in and sit down with the engineers, and they have this never-ending series of prototype horns, because you'll always hear, oh, Selmer's about to come out with a new horn. I saw this thing. And my friend Scott Campbell, who's the woodwind category manager at Selmer, told me, people always say that because there are always prototypes around, because they're always trying to make the current models better, or maybe start thinking about a new model down in the future. People began to take this scientific approach to instrument design around the Mark VI. But again, it was really one of the first times where they spent that much time tweaking with a professional. Sixes have a certain sound. I have never felt the need to own one of my own. My own setup, I am a Selmer artist. I play a Series 3 soprano, a Series 2 alto, and I have a 7 tenor just because I got a really good deal on it. And it's a really good example of a Mark 7. I paid I've got less than $1,500 in the horn, including the case, and it's great. Get a good quality horn and then do your long tones and do a lot of listening, and it's about all the same. But sometimes some people are going for a very particular sound after they've done their homework, and especially for some jazz players, they're only going to get that certain ring out of a Mark 6, and I understand that. But again, some people love Buschers, some people love Kahns. I'm a modern horn guy through and through, both for classical and jazz playing, just because the intonation's always better on the really good modern horn.
Thank you.
Oh, of course, yeah. Sorry, I'm sitting here sipping my. I just reminded myself of one of our old dear teachers doing that motion on camera. That's weird how that pops up sometimes.
Chris.
I have a question. With the introduction of new saxophones and everything throughout the history of the saxophone, have there been any like things that you thought are just a huge mistake or huge plus? I'll say that because I don't know what word I was trying to think of. Any upgrades or anything, I guess?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest upgrades are things we take for granted today. I was talking about, at one point saxophones had 2 octave mechanisms, and have any of you guys played oboe as a secondary or like in woodwind tech class or anything yet? Oboes still have the 2 octave keys. I was just teaching oboe and woodwind methods today, and I went on a whole diatribe of how dumb that was when people had invented double octave keys. Literally, you'd have to sit there and do this between the G and the A. And I've played one of those once. It's maddening, just for somebody who's used to something simpler. The bis key, the side F sharp, those little things have stuck around. Whereas instrument manufacturers came up with all kinds of interesting things. There's a mechanism on some old Kahns where you can do an E flat, a D to E flat trill by lifting your middle finger in your right hand. Some of those things were great ideas, just like the mechanism was too complicated, so they didn't stick around. I think the biggest thing that irks me today is when people sell horns saying, well, this is like the vintage horn. There was actually an American saxophone manufacturing company that tried to basically make a copy of a Kahn Super 20, which is a beautiful old horn made in the 60s that part of the body is silver. Well, you can buy a used Super 20 for like $2,000, and they were selling this thing for $5,000. Why is anybody going to buy the copy? So some manufacturers do dumb things, kind of chasing trends or chasing. The biggest thing, actually, that I would always steer you guys away from: don't buy the $500 jazz mouthpiece. Don't do it. Don't buy the weird manufacturer. Well, this plays just like a 50s Florida slant, whatever. I'm a Van Doren guy, so take this with a grain of salt. Buy the $120 V16 jazz mouthpiece. It's going to sound better. Or get your hands on a really good quality modern link or a really good quality Meyer. The manufacturer's changing hands, from what I understand, so the quality should be better on those in the next year or two. But just get something that's not $1 million, because you know what I see all the time? People reselling those $500 jazz mouthpieces after they played on them for 3 weeks and figured out, oh yeah, I don't like this. And seriously, there are really great $500 jazz mouthpieces that, if you really know what you're doing, you really know what you're looking for, just, you guys as students, just stick with something reasonable and just do your long tones and it'll work. Yeah, because I mean, there are great ones. It's just, I'm cheap. I'm just really cheap. That's all. Because there are ones that are worth it, but also there are ones that are just all marketing. All marketing.
I agree with you.
All
Someone
marketing.
I know just has a lot of mouthpieces.
Because like I said, somebody like Dan, he's been around the block. He's played everything. He's done his homework. Just with you guys, don't fall for the marketing. Play a bunch of stuff before you ever sink that much money into anything. I will never buy a $500 mouthpiece. All of my mouthpieces costed like $150 or less. They're all Van Doren. I'm super happy with them. Go Van Doren. There's me being a shill for the day. Anyway.
And also, usually what happens is you go back to the original one you played on forever.
You really do. You know how many times I've gone back to my Optimum? I'm stuck on the profile now. This is the first time that I tried going back to the Optimum, and I still like the new mouthpiece better. But yeah, I've gone back to my Optimum 15 times. It's the same one that I bought in 2005. And my Jazz Alto mouthpiece is the same V16 I've been playing on since 2002. I bought it when I was a junior in high school. I still play on the same one.
Still got me a Larry Teal.
Classic.
Yeah.
I broke the beak on mine, and it was a special one. So I was like, all right, back to the Optimum.
Okay, anybody else have anything else? We all good? Okay, do the thing I like you to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. It was absolutely my pleasure. Dr. Laboda is the best. She is an incredible musician and an incredible teacher and an incredible friend. So I thank you guys, and I thank her very much for listening to the ramblings of an old saxophone prof tonight. I appreciate you guys.
Okay, you guys are good to go. Bye. See you in your lessons. Don't forget them tomorrow.
Thank you, friend.
Thank you.
Also, Tracy says hi. I did.
Oh.
I hadn't done any studio classes all semester,
And then
I
you
did
have two in
both
one
of yours
day.
today. Yeah.
I know, I saw that. And I was like, whoa. Uh-oh.
I think you guys literally asked me within a couple of days of each other too. So.
Really?